In the years following the Civil War, the United States saw massive growth. The newly reunited nation became an industrial giant as old industries grew and new industries emerged. Westward expansion also continued, and as settlers pushed westward, new infrastructure followed them. Railroads in particular saw massive growth, and rail lines connected distant frontier lands to the rest of the country. Unbeknownst to the American people at the time, this volatile mix of westward expansion and building of new railroads would give rise to one of the boldest forms of crime this nation has ever seen, the train robbery. And all this would start in an unsuspecting small town in Indiana. By carrying out the first train robberies, the Reno gang acted as a turning point in history by inspiring a wave of similar crimes across 19th century America, known as the train robbery era, that terrorized the nation and had a massive cultural impact. Frank, John, Sim, and Bill Reno were born in the small town of Rockford in Jackson County, Indiana, to strict Methodist parents in the 1840s. The brothers were known to get into trouble early on. John and Frank scammed travelers in rigged card games, and they were suspected of starting several fires and stealing a horse during the 1850s. When the Civil War began, Frank, John, and Sim became bounty jumpers. They were paid to enlist in the Union Army, and then they would never appear for duty. They continued doing this to make a profit until returning to the now ghost town of Rockford in 1864, which had been burned and mostly deserted during the war. Hidden in the ruins of Rockford, the brothers formed a gang under the leadership of John and began to terrorize Jackson County, particularly the town of Seymour, carrying out robberies and arson. After the Civil War ended, the gang gained several new members, largely other bounty jumpers, and began to branch out into other counties. There, they began robbing merchants and raiding communities. By 1865, the Renos had become a force to be reckoned with, and the July 27, 1865 issue of the Seymour Times issued a warning to visitors of the area to be wary of thieves and assassins that infest the place. But the brothers and their gang had bigger plans. Seymour was built on the junction of two rail lines, and due to a safety bill, trains on both lines had to stop there. The brothers realized that the trains would be easy to board unnoticed and then plunder far away from major population centers. On October 6, 1866, John Reno, Sim Reno, and gang member Frank Sparks boarded a train on the east-to-west rail line owned by the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad Company as it left the depot at Seymour. As the train sped into sparsely populated South Indiana, the gang unknowingly changed history and broke into the train's express car. They restrained the messenger and broke into a safe carrying approximately $16,000, worth over $300,000 today. While the Renos escaped after the robbery, they had also unknowingly just made their greatest enemy, the Pinkerton Detective Agency. This private police force, headed by Alan Pinkerton, had been hired to protect the O&M rail line, and they now had their sights set on the Renos. A passenger on the O&M train named George Kinney stepped forward and identified two of the robbers. The three robbers were arrested but bailed out of jail, and shortly after, George Kinney was found dead. When other passengers were too afraid to testify and make enemies of the Renos, the case was dropped. But the Renos didn't stop there. They had seen firsthand the wealth that larger-scale crimes could bring, and they were hungry for more. It was time for the Renos to leave Jackson County. They headed west into Missouri, where they raided the Davis County Courthouse on November 17, 1867, and made off with another $23,000. However, the Pinkertons, who had been hot on their trail, identified and arrested John Reno, the gang's leader. Frank was forced to take control and leave the state once again, so they headed north into Iowa. 3 robberies followed in quick succession, each on a courthouse or county treasurer, and each ending with the Renos' escape. That was until Frank Reno and other gang members were found hiding out in Council Bluffs, Iowa by the Pinkertons. They were arrested and sent to jail. However, this Pinkerton victory was short-lived, because on April 1st, the 3 gang members escaped the jail and left only a simple message written in chalk on the cell wall: April Fools. This seemingly unstoppable spree of crime throughout the Midwest was making people angry, and in response, the Jackson County Vigilante Committee was formed in March of 1868 with the goal of using vigilante justice and lynch law to protect Jackson County from crime, particularly the Renos. However, the Renos were not deterred by their growing notoriety, and on May 22nd they carried out their largest job by far. Late at night, a northbound train stopped at the small town of Marshfield, Indiana to refuel, when it was boarded by 12 men who emerged from the darkness. 4 of the robbers broke into the express car and threw the messenger from the train. They then broke into the safe and took an estimated $96,000, which is over $2 million today. The robbers then split up and went into hiding. This shocking crime garnered national attention and was featured in newspapers across the country, such as the Chicago Tribune and the May 25th edition of the New York Tribune, that described the clean deal the Renos made of the train. After the Reno brothers went into hiding, 6 other gang members attempted to rob a 5th train on July 10, 1868, near Brownsburg, Indiana. However, they were ambushed and wounded by Pinkerton agents, and gang member Val Elliott was captured. In custody, he provided information to lawmen that led to the arrest of his accomplices. The other 5 robbers were tracked down and taken into custody. However, when they were being brought to Seymour by train on July 25th, they were stopped by a mob in scarlet masks. It was the Jackson County Vigilance Society, who had sworn to make the gang pay. They hanged the gang members from a beech tree at what is now known as Hangman's Crossing in Jackson County. Over the next several months, the remaining gang members would be tracked down by the Pinkertons. Sim and William Reno were found in Indianapolis, and Frank Reno and his accomplices were found in Windsor, Canada. On December 11, 1868, the story of the Reno gang came to an end when 100 masked men stormed the jail the Renos were being held in Jackson County and killed the last members of the gang. The death of the Reno brothers was reported nationwide and celebrated by many, particularly in the Midwest, but the Renos had already left their mark on the nation. Their crime spree marked the beginning of what would come to be known as the train robbery era. 2 years later, on July 21, 1870, a gang of 8 men inspired by the exploits of the Renos derailed and robbed a train near Council Bluffs, Iowa. That same year in November, the first train robbery in the West occurred in Verde, Nevada. In the mid-1870s, another gang went on a train robbery spree similar to that of the Renos, the notorious James Younger gang, who carried out their first train robbery outside of Adair, Iowa, and then many more throughout the Midwest in the following years. Their exploits were so widely known that they are often falsely credited with inventing the train robbery. Over the next 2 decades, train robberies spread south and west, becoming frequent in America's frontier lands, where law enforcement was scarcer. The Rube Burroughs gang robbed several trains in Texas and Arkansas in the 1880s, and Butch Cassidy led the infamous Wild Bunch, who carried out robberies in the sparsely populated territories of Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. While train robbery had begun in the Midwest, it took hold and was the biggest problem in America's frontierlands and peaked in the 1890s. By the 1890s, train robbery had become a massive problem, and people proposed the death penalty, Secret Service, private police, and even the U.S. military be used to curb these numbers. In an 1893 Washington Post interview, Tennessee Senator Isham Harris said, "People generally have no idea as to the enormity and extent of these crimes. It has been found that local courts are ineffectual in dealing with them, and train robbing has become so common that we read of one almost every day." While train robbery is often associated with the Wild West, it took hold because of Indiana's very own gang of outlaws. As that same edition of the Washington Post remarked, their crime spree marked the rise of that now flourishing criminal industry. The crime spree of the Reno gang was truly a turning point in U.S. history because it inspired, directly or indirectly, hundreds of train robberies over the next 20 years. The train robbery era was also a turning point in and of itself. Western train robberies greatly shaped today's cultural perception of the Wild West, and train robberies have been central in countless Western movies, books, and video games. While the Renos were featured in their own 1955 movie, Rage at Dawn, they have been largely overshadowed by more famous train robbers. However, their Midwestern crime spree inspired a decades-long, nationwide wave of robberies that changed America forever.